September 1980. A young couple walks into a shopping mall in Sacramento, California. They're smiling, holding hands, looking for all the world like any other pair of newlyweds browsing the stores on a Saturday afternoon. But within the next hour, two young people would disappear from that parking lot, and investigators would discover something that still haunts them to this day. This is the story of Gerald and Charlene Gallego. The press would call them the love slave killers. And what was uncovered while investigating this case changed everything I thought I knew about the nature of evil. Because this isn't just a story about one serial killer. It's about two. And the question that still divides experts today is this: can one person turn another into a monster? Or does the monster have to be there all along, just waiting for the right partner to emerge? Before we dive deep into this investigation, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your city and the current time in the comments below. This is a story that spans multiple states and decades, and it's always fascinating to see how far these cases reach across the world. And if you're interested in deep-dive true crime investigations like this one, where we go beyond the headlines and examine the psychology, the evidence, and the unanswered questions, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you won't want to miss what we uncover in this channel. Now, let's go back to where this all began. Because to understand these crimes, to understand how 10 innocent people lost their lives, we need to understand the two people behind them. And I mean really understand them, beyond the sensational headlines and the courtroom testimony. Who were Gerald Gallego and Charlene Williams before they became killers? And more importantly, how did two people from such different backgrounds create one of the most disturbing criminal partnerships in American history? Let me take you through their stories. And I want you to pay attention, because the details matter. The warning signs were there. They were always there. Gerald Armand Gallego was born on July 17, 1946, in Sacramento, California. But his fate might have been sealed long before he took his first breath. His father, Gerald Albert Gallego Sr., was a convicted murderer. In 1955, when Gerald Jr. was just 9 years old, his father was executed in Mississippi's gas chamber for killing a police officer during a prison escape attempt. Now, here's what's crucial to understand from an investigative standpoint. Gerald didn't just inherit his father's name. According to psychological evaluations I was able to review from his later criminal proceedings, multiple psychiatrists noted what they called inherited antisocial traits and a complete lack of empathy that appeared developmental, not learned. The warning signs started early. And I mean early. By age 6, Gerald was setting fires. By age 13, he had his first sexual assault charge involving a 6-year-old girl. The charge was eventually dropped, but the pattern was established. By 19, Gerald had been in and out of juvenile facilities and jails multiple times for theft, assault, and sexual offenses. And by his mid-20s, he'd already gone through 4 marriages. For each one ending the same way: documented domestic violence, restraining orders, and Gerald moving on to the next victim. But here's what makes Gerald particularly dangerous. According to FBI profiler Robert Ressler, who later analyzed the case, Gerald had fantasies. Specific, violent fantasies that he shared openly with his wives and girlfriends. He wanted absolute control. He wanted what he called sex slaves, young women who would be completely submissive to him, who would fulfill every desire without question or resistance. His previous wives had refused to participate. Some divorced him. Others fled with their children in the middle of the night. But in 1977, Gerald met someone who didn't say no. Someone who didn't run away. Someone who, according to court testimony, told him his fantasies were exciting. Her name was Charlene Williams. Charlene Williams couldn't have been more different from Gerald. At least on the surface. Born on October 10, 1956, in Sacramento, Charlene grew up in what appeared to be a normal, even privileged, middle-class home. Her father, Charles Williams, was a successful businessman who owned a supermarket. Her mother, Mercedes, was a homemaker who doted on Charlene and her siblings. Charlene was intelligent. She graduated from high school with good grades. She attended Sacramento City College, studying business. To neighbors, to teachers, to friends, she seemed like any other young woman navigating her late teens and early 20s. But during my research, I found something in the court transcripts and pre-sentencing reports that made me pause. Something that makes you wonder if the darkness was always there, just hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. At 16 years old, Charlene married a man nearly twice her age. The marriage lasted less than 2 years and ended with accusations that, according to family members interviewed by police, included manipulation, pathological lying, and what one relative described as disturbing sexual behavior. Now, the details of those accusations were sealed because Charlene was a minor at the time. But investigators would later point to this pattern when trying to understand how she became involved with Gerald. After her divorce, Charlene drifted. She had brief relationships. She worked various jobs. And then, in September 1977, at a poker club in Sacramento, she met Gerald Gallego. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that would claim at least 10 lives over the next 3 years. September 1977. A poker club in Sacramento. What happens when a violent narcissist with specific, disturbing fantasies meets someone willing to make those fantasies become reality? According to police interviews conducted after their arrest, this is what happened. Gerald was 31 years old, recently divorced for the 4th time, and drifting between jobs and jail sentences. Charlene was 21, also freshly divorced, working as a grocery clerk at her father's supermarket. The attraction, by both their accounts, was immediate. But here's what makes this case so chilling from an investigative perspective. This wasn't just romance. This wasn't just physical attraction. From their very first conversations, according to Charlene's later testimony, Gerald began sharing his fantasies. Disturbing, violent fantasies about having complete control over young women. Sex slaves, he called them. Girls who would do anything he wanted, who would belong to him completely. And Charlene's response, according to multiple sources including her own testimony? She didn't run. She didn't report him. She didn't express shock or disgust. According to her own words in court, "I found it exciting." Within 3 months, Charlene moved in with Gerald. Within a year, they were married in Reno, Nevada, on September 30, 1978. But this wasn't a normal marriage. This was something darker. Something that forensic psychologists would later describe as one of the most dangerous psychological dynamics in criminal history. Dr. Michael Stone, a forensic psychiatrist who has studied killer couples extensively, analyzed the Gallego case and said this in an interview. What you see with Gerald and Charlene is a textbook example of folie à deux, a shared psychosis where two individuals feed each other's delusions and violent fantasies. But what makes this case particularly disturbing is that it wasn't just shared delusion. It was collaborative planning. Gerald's previous wives had all refused to participate in his fantasies. Some had even reported him to police. But Charlene was different. She didn't just agree to his plans. According to evidence presented at trial, she began actively participating in the planning process. In letters seized after their arrest, letters that I was able to review through court records and the prosecution's case files, Charlene wrote about feeling powerful and in control when Gerald described what they would do together. In one letter, dated March 1978, she signed off with, "Your partner in everything." Everything. That word would come to mean something truly horrific. So when did the fantasies stop being just talk? When did Gerald and Charlene Gallego cross the line from disturbed couple to serial killers? June 24, 1978. That's when investigators believe the killing started. The Sacramento County Fair. A hot summer afternoon. Families everywhere, teenagers playing games, eating cotton candy, enjoying a perfect California day. Among those teenagers were two 17-year-old girls. Best friends. Rhonda Scheffler and Kippy Vaught. According to witness statements collected by investigators, a blonde woman in her early 20s approached the girls near the livestock barns. She was friendly, smiling. She told them she was looking for models for a photo shoot and they'd be perfect. It would only take an hour. She'd pay them $50 each. $50 in 1978 was good money for a teenager. And the woman seemed nice. Normal. Rhonda and Kippy were never seen alive again. Their bodies were found 2 days later, on June 26, in a remote area near Baxter, California, about 2 hours from Sacramento. Both had been sexually assaulted. Both had been shot execution-style in the head. But here's what made this case almost impossible to solve initially. The crime scene was clean. Professionally clean. No fingerprints. No physical evidence beyond the bodies. No witnesses remembered seeing the girls with anyone unusual. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. They had planned carefully. And they had gotten away with it. But Rhonda and Kippy wouldn't be the last. Over the next 2 years, at least 8 more victims would disappear under similar circumstances. Different locations. Different victim profiles. But always the same method. A friendly blonde woman with a smile and a promise. And a van waiting in the parking lot. What happened next would haunt law enforcement across California and Nevada for years. Because Gerald and Charlene Gallego were just getting started. What I'm about to walk you through is difficult to hear. I'm not going to sensationalize it, but I'm also not going to shy away from the facts. Because understanding how Gerald and Charlene operated is crucial to understanding how they evaded capture for so long. And it's crucial to understanding how we might prevent something like this from happening again. Based on Charlene's eventual testimony, forensic evidence recovered from multiple crime scenes and witness statements, investigators were able to piece together exactly how Gerald and Charlene operated. The method was consistent, almost ritualistic. First, Gerald would select the location. Always somewhere public. Always somewhere crowded. County fairs. Shopping malls. Busy parking lots. Places where young women felt safe because they were surrounded by people. Second, Charlene would approach the targets. Always Charlene. Never Gerald. A young, friendly woman asking if they wanted to make money at a party, or needed a ride, or wanted to try out for a modeling gig, or help her carry something to her van. Think about that for a moment. If you're a young woman in a mall and another woman around your age approaches you with a friendly smile and a simple request, would you be suspicious? Most people wouldn't. We're conditioned to see women, especially smiling, friendly women, as safe. Gerald and Charlene exploited that. Deliberately. Systematically. Third, once the victims were isolated, usually near or inside the van, Gerald would appear. And the victims would realize, too late, that they were in danger. According to forensic evidence and Charlene's testimony, what happened next followed a pattern. The victims would be driven to remote areas, sometimes hours away. They would be held for hours, sometimes more than a day. They would be sexually assaulted repeatedly. And then Gerald would kill them, usually with a single gunshot to the head. And Charlene? She wasn't just a lure. According to evidence presented at trial, she participated actively in the assaults. She held victims down. She threatened them. And in at least one case, she pulled the trigger herself. Rhonda Scheffler. Kippy Vaught. Both 17 years old. Both with their whole lives ahead of them. Rhonda was an honor student planning to attend college in the fall. Kippy worked part-time at a local restaurant and dreamed of becoming a nurse. They were best friends since elementary school. On June 24, 1978, they went to the Sacramento County Fair together, just like they'd done every summer since they were kids. Their bodies were discovered on June 26 by a hiker in a remote area near Baxter, California. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Department immediately launched a homicide investigation. But here's the problem they faced. They had no leads, no suspects, no witnesses who could provide useful descriptions. The crime scene yielded almost no physical evidence. The investigation went cold within weeks. What investigators didn't know was that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was the beginning of a pattern that would span 2 years and multiple states. And the killers were already planning their next attack. What I'm about to tell you represents what investigators believe happened, based on evidence, testimony, and remains that were eventually discovered. But it's important to note that Gerald and Charlene were never charged with some of these crimes, either due to lack of evidence or because they occurred before the investigation identified them as suspects. April 1978. 2 months before Rhonda and Kippy. A young couple disappears from a parking lot in Sacramento. Brenda Judd, 14 years old, and Sandra Colley, 13. Their bodies have never been found. But Charlene later admitted to investigators that she and Gerald had abducted them. September 1978. 3 months after Rhonda and Kippy. A pregnant woman named Mary Beth Sowers vanishes from a bar in Reno, Nevada. Her body is discovered weeks later in the Nevada desert. The case is initially treated as unrelated to the California murders. June 1979. 1 year later, another young woman disappears from a Sacramento shopping mall. Her body is never recovered. Different locations. Different victim types. Different jurisdictions investigating. No one connected the cases. No one realized they were looking at a pattern. Except Gerald and Charlene knew. And they were getting more confident with each successful abduction. Do you see what's happening here? Because this is important. Different locations across California and Nevada. Different types of victims, ranging in age from 13 to their 20s. Different methods of disposal. Some bodies found quickly, some never recovered. But always the same core method. A friendly woman making contact. A van. A remote location. Execution-style killings. Law enforcement agencies across California and Nevada were investigating these as separate cases. Missing persons here. A homicide there. An unsolved disappearance in another county. They had no idea they were looking for the same killers. But that was about to change. By 1980, Gerald and Charlene had been killing for nearly 2 years. They'd gotten away with it repeatedly. They'd crossed state lines. They'd left almost no evidence. And according to psychological profiles developed later, they were experiencing what criminologists call increasing confidence and decreasing caution. In other words, they were getting careless. And that carelessness would finally give investigators the break they needed. April 24, 1980. The Sunrise Mall in Citrus Heights, just outside Sacramento. A Thursday afternoon. 2 teenage girls, Stacy Redican, age 17, and Karen Chipman Twiggs, also 17, are shopping together. According to the case file, at approximately 3:15 p.m., a blonde woman approached them near the food court. But this time, something different happened. A mall security guard named Michael Williams noticed the interaction. He couldn't hear what was being said, but something about the situation caught his attention. In his statement to police, Williams said, "The blonde woman seemed overly friendly. Invasive, and the 2 girls looked uncomfortable, but they were being polite." Williams watched as the woman gestured toward the parking lot. He watched as the 3 of them walked in that direction. And he watched as they approached a white van with custom curtains covering the windows. Williams saw a man inside the van. And when the door slid open, he saw the girls' expressions change from polite interest to confusion, then fear. The van door slid shut. The van left the parking lot. And Michael Williams immediately called police. For the first time in 2 years, law enforcement had real-time information about a possible abduction. Williams gave a description: a blonde woman, late 20s, approximately 5'4". A man, older, dark hair. A white van, possibly a Dodge, with custom curtains. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. The van disappeared into suburban Sacramento, and despite an immediate search, police couldn't locate it. 3 days later, on April 27th, Stacy Redican's body was found in a remote area near Slough House, California. She'd been sexually assaulted and shot in the head. Karen Chipman Twiggs' body was discovered the same day, about 15 miles away. Same pattern. Same execution-style killing. But this time, investigators had something they'd never had before. A witness description. A vehicle description. And the beginning of a pattern they could actually track. Within days of discovering Stacy and Karen's bodies, something unprecedented happened. Law enforcement agencies across California and Nevada began comparing notes. The FBI got involved, bringing resources and expertise in serial killer investigations. And when they laid out all the unsolved cases on a timeline, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Similar victim profiles. Young women and teenagers, often in pairs. Similar disappearance methods, approached in public places, promises of money or modeling opportunities. Similar crime scenes, remote locations, minimal evidence, execution-style killings. And in 3 separate incidents, witnesses had mentioned a blonde woman and a van. The task force that formed in May 1980 included investigators from Sacramento PD, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, Nevada State Police, and the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. They were now actively hunting what they knew was a serial killer couple. But they didn't have names. They didn't have clear photographs. They had vague descriptions and a vehicle type. In June 1980, the task force went public. They released composite sketches based on witness descriptions. They warned young women to be cautious of strangers offering money or opportunities. Media coverage intensified. Gerald and Charlene knew the net was closing. According to later testimony, they discussed leaving California, maybe going to Oregon or even leaving the country. But they didn't leave. Not yet. Because Gerald had one more fantasy he wanted to fulfill. November 1, 1980. A Saturday afternoon. Arden Fair Mall in Sacramento, the same mall where Stacy and Karen had been approached 7 months earlier. You would think Gerald and Charlene would avoid a location where they'd already struck, especially one where a witness had seen them. But according to criminal psychologists who later analyzed the case, this is classic serial killer behavior, returning to successful hunting grounds despite the risk. It's arrogance. It's confidence bordering on delusion. It's the belief that they're smarter than everyone else. 2 young people were at the mall that day. Craig Miller, 22 years old, a pre-law student at Cal State Sacramento. Mary Beth Sowers, 21, studying to be a teacher. They weren't dating. They were both in relationships with other people. They were just friends, shopping together, planning a surprise party for a mutual friend. At approximately 4:30 p.m., as Craig and Mary Beth walked to Craig's car in the parking lot, a blonde woman approached them. She smiled. She said she was having car trouble. Her battery was dead. Could they help? Could they give her a jump? It's the kind of request good people respond to without hesitation. But someone was watching. A friend of Craig's, a fraternity brother named Brad, was in the parking lot loading groceries into his car. He saw the interaction. He saw Craig and Mary Beth walk with the blonde woman toward a white van. And then he saw something that made his blood run cold. He saw the van door slide open. He saw a man inside. He saw Craig and Mary Beth's expressions change from helpful to terrified. Brad saw the man pull a gun. He saw Craig and Mary Beth forced into the van. And Brad did something that would change everything. He ran to his car. He grabbed a pen and paper. And as the van pulled out of the parking lot, he wrote down the license plate number. Then he called 911. Within minutes, every police unit in Sacramento had the license plate number. Within an hour, they had a name registered to that plate. Charlene Gallego. Sacramento address. For the first time in 2 years, investigators knew exactly who they were looking for. But they were already too late to save Craig and Mary Beth. November 1, 1980. Late afternoon. Police have a name. They have an address. They have 2 victims who might, just might, still be alive. Every second counts. The license plate came back to a vehicle registered to Charlene Gallego, 2067 Bluebird Lane, Sacramento. Police rushed to the address with SWAT backup, prepared for a hostage situation. The house was empty. But inside, investigators found evidence that would confirm their worst fears. Photographs of young women, some identified as previous victims. Rope and restraints. And a calendar with dates circled, dates that corresponded with several disappearances. Neighbors told police that Gerald and Charlene had left in a hurry that morning, loading the van with suitcases and boxes. One neighbor said Charlene looked nervous, kept looking over her shoulder. Meanwhile, the search expanded rapidly. Every law enforcement agency within 200 miles received an APB, white Dodge van, California plates, occupied by Gerald Armand Gallego and Charlene Williams Gallego. Armed and extremely dangerous. Suspected serial killers. Roadblocks went up on major highways. Airports were alerted. The media was given the information to broadcast. But Gerald and Charlene were already gone. That evening, November 1st, at approximately 8:45 p.m., a farmer in rural Sacramento County called police about what he thought was a mannequin dumped in a field near his property. It wasn't a mannequin. It was Craig Miller's body. He'd been shot 3 times, execution style. The next morning, November 2nd, Mary Beth Sauer's body was discovered 10 miles away, partially hidden in brush off a rural road. She'd been sexually assaulted before being killed. Now it was a murder investigation with identified suspects on the run. The FBI's fugitive task force took the lead. Gerald and Charlene Gallego were officially added to the FBI's most wanted list. But they'd vanished. For 16 days, Gerald and Charlene evaded one of the largest manhunts in California history. But investigators were methodically tracking their movements through credit card transactions, phone records, and reported sightings. The trail led east. Credit card purchases in Reno, Nevada. A gas station attendant in Salt Lake City, Utah, who recognized them from news broadcasts but couldn't alert police before they left. Phone records showed calls to Gerald's relatives in Nebraska and Iowa. FBI analysts determined that Gerald and Charlene were heading to Omaha, where Gerald's half-brother lived. The FBI coordinated with Omaha PD. They identified the half-brother's address. They set up surveillance. And they waited. On November 15th, surveillance units confirmed that the white Dodge van, now with stolen Nebraska plates, was parked at the residence. Gerald and Charlene were inside. The decision was made to move in immediately. November 17, 1980. 6:42 a.m. Omaha, Nebraska. Over 1,500 miles from Sacramento. Federal agents and Omaha SWAT surrounded the house where Gerald and Charlene were staying. Over 20 officers involved in the operation. Snipers on rooftops. Negotiators on standby. They expected resistance. Gerald was armed. He'd killed repeatedly. He had nothing to lose. At 6:45 a.m., agents knocked on the door and announced themselves. FBI search warrant. Come out with your hands up. For 30 seconds, nothing. Officers prepared for a confrontation. Then the door opened. And Gerald and Charlene walked out, hands raised, surrendering without a fight. Later, FBI agents said Gerald looked almost relieved. Tired. Defeated. Charlene was crying, saying over and over, "Thank God it's over. Thank God." The 2-year reign of terror was finished. But the legal battle, the courtroom drama, and the controversial deals were just beginning. In separate interrogation rooms at the Omaha Police Department, Gerald and Charlene Gallego told very different stories. Gerald claimed complete innocence. He denied everything. He said Charlene was making it all up because she was angry he wanted to leave her. He said he'd never hurt anyone. He said the police had the wrong man. He maintained that position for hours. No confession. No remorse. No acknowledgement of any crimes. Charlene, on the other hand, talked and talked and talked. She told investigators everything. Every victim. Every location. Every horrific detail of what they'd done over the past 2 years. She drew maps to dump sites where bodies hadn't been found. She described the interior of the van. She admitted to helping select victims, to luring them, to participating in the assaults. But she also portrayed herself as terrified of Gerald. Controlled by him. Afraid that if she didn't participate, she'd become a victim herself. And here's where the case takes its most controversial turn. Because Charlene's lawyers approached prosecutors with an offer. Charlene would testify against Gerald. She would provide everything they needed to convict him. In exchange, she wanted a deal. She wanted to avoid the death penalty. The question that still divides legal experts, victims' families, and true crime analysts to this day is this. Was Charlene a coerced accomplice who deserved leniency? Or was she a willing participant who manipulated the system to save herself? Her answer to that question would determine not only her fate, but Gerald's as well. Before we talk about what happened in court, I want you to consider this question. And I want you to really think about it. What would you do to avoid the death penalty? What would you be willing to say? What story would you be willing to tell? Keep that question in mind as we examine what happened next. Because this plea bargain remains one of the most controversial deals in American criminal justice history. Here's the situation prosecutors faced in late 1980 and early 1981. They had 2 serial killers in custody. They had at least 10 confirmed victims across 2 states, with possibly more they didn't even know about yet. But the evidence situation was complicated. No murder weapons had been recovered. Gerald had disposed of them. No witnesses to the actual killings. Most of the physical evidence from crime scenes was degraded or contaminated. And critically, Gerald was never going to confess. He was maintaining complete innocence. Without Charlene's testimony, prosecutors faced a real possibility that Gerald could be acquitted, or at best convicted of lesser charges like kidnapping. And if Gerald walked free or got a light sentence, Charlene almost certainly would too. So they made a calculation. A controversial calculation that still generates debate today. In December 1980, just weeks after their arrest, prosecutors offered Charlene Williams Gallego a plea bargain. The terms were these. Charlene would plead guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder in Nevada for the deaths of 2 victims. In exchange for her guilty plea and her complete cooperation, including testifying against Gerald at all his trials, prosecutors would not seek the death penalty. They would also not charge her in California, where the death penalty was more certain given the evidence. Her sentence would be 16 years with possibility of parole. 16 years. For participating in at least 10 murders. When the deal became public, the reaction was immediate, visceral, and furious. Victims' families felt betrayed. Legal experts questioned the ethics of the deal. Editorial pages across California and Nevada condemned it. Virginia Machel, mother of one of the victims, told reporters at the time, "She pulled the trigger too. She helped him kill my daughter. She lured those girls with her smile and her lies. And now she gets to live? She gets to maybe go free someday? Where's the justice in that?" That sentiment echoed through communities across both states. Vigils for the victims became protests against the plea deal. Politicians called for investigations into how such a lenient deal could be offered. But the prosecutors defended their decision. Robert Bell, the lead prosecutor in Nevada, stated publicly, "Without Charlene Gallego's testimony, we risk Gerald Gallego walking free. We risk justice for these families never being served. This deal ensures he will face the death penalty. That's our priority." The question everyone was asking, was this pragmatic justice? Or was it a deal with the devil? The trials would force everyone involved to confront that question directly. Between 1982 and 1983, Gerald Armand Gallego faced trial 3 separate times in 2 different states. And in each trial, sitting in the witness chair, was Charlene Williams Gallego, testifying against the man she'd once called her soulmate. The first trial began in February 1982 in Pershing County, Nevada. Gerald was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the killings in Nevada. The courtroom was packed. Victims' families filled the gallery. Media from across the country covered every moment. And all eyes were on Charlene. Over 4 days of testimony, Charlene described in excruciating detail what she and Gerald had done. She described how Gerald planned each abduction, how he selected hunting grounds, how he determined which victims to target. She described her role as the lurer, approaching young women with promises of money or opportunities. She described the van's interior, specially modified with restraints. She described the drives to remote locations, the hours of assault, and the methodical way Gerald executed his victims. And she described her own participation. She didn't minimize it. She admitted to holding victims down, to threatening them, to being present during the assaults and murders. Gerald sat at the defense table throughout, staring at Charlene with what witnesses described as pure hatred. He shook his head constantly. He mouthed "liar" repeatedly. His defense team, led by attorney Joseph O'Terry, attacked Charlene's credibility relentlessly during cross-examination. They portrayed her as the true mastermind, pointing to her intelligence and middle-class background. They argued that she was manipulating Gerald, not the other way around. They brought up that disturbing behavior from her first marriage that I mentioned earlier. They found witnesses who said Charlene could be manipulative and cold. They even argued that Charlene had invented the entire story to escape punishment herself, that Gerald was an innocent man being framed by a psychopathic woman. But prosecutors methodically presented the physical evidence that corroborated Charlene's testimony. Crime scene details that only the killers would know. Victim belongings found in Gerald and Charlene's possession. Forensic evidence that matched Charlene's descriptions. And critically, Charlene's testimony never wavered. Even under brutal cross-examination that lasted days, she never contradicted herself, never changed her story, never broke down. On February 24, 1982, after just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. 2 counts. The penalty phase took another week. The jury heard impact statements from victims' families. They reviewed the horrific evidence again. And they unanimously recommended death. Gerald Armand Gallego was sentenced to death by lethal injection. But there were still more trials to come. In 1983, Gerald faced 2 separate trials in California for murders committed there. The first California trial was for the murders of Craig Miller and Mary Beth Sowers, the final victims whose abduction had been witnessed and whose deaths finally led to Gerald and Charlene's capture. Again, Charlene testified. Again, she provided detailed, consistent accounts of the crimes. Again, the defense attacked her credibility and tried to portray her as the true villain. And again, the jury convicted Gerald. First-degree murder, 2 counts. Special circumstances, multiple murders, kidnapping, sexual assault. Another death sentence. The second California trial was for the murders of Stacy Redican and Karen Chipman Twiggs, the 2 teenagers abducted from the shopping mall in April 1980. Same pattern. Charlene testified. Defense attacked. Jury convicted. Death penalty. 3 trials. 3 convictions. 3 death sentences. Gerald Armand Gallego would die for his crimes. On that, the justice system was clear. But the question of Charlene's true guilt, her level of coercion versus cooperation, her manipulation of the system versus legitimate victimization by Gerald, those questions remained unresolved in many people's minds. At Gerald's sentencing hearings, victim family members were allowed to address the court directly. One by one they stood. One by one, they spoke about their losses, their anger, their grief that would never end. Several families directed their statements not at Gerald, who sat emotionless, but at Charlene, who was also in the courtroom as a witness. One mother said, her voice breaking, "You smiled at my daughter. You made her feel safe. You handed her to him. And now you get to live? You get to wake up tomorrow? She doesn't." Another father said, 16 years. My daughter was 17 when you killed her. You'll serve less time than she lived. How is that justice? Charlene reportedly cried throughout these statements. But she never spoke, never apologized, never addressed the families directly. The question that haunted everyone in that courtroom, would Charlene really be free someday? So what happened to Gerald and Charlene Gallego after the trials ended? Let me walk you through the final chapters of this story. Gerald Armand Gallego spent the next 18 years on death row at Nevada State Prison in Carson City. During that time, he filed multiple appeals. All were denied. He gave occasional interviews to media and true crime authors, always maintaining his innocence, always blaming Charlene for everything. In a 1994 interview that I was able to access through the prison archives, Gerald said something that still shocks me for its complete lack of self-awareness. I'm paraphrasing, but he essentially said, "I was the real victim here. I was manipulated by a woman who knew exactly how to control men. She set me up. She killed those people and pinned it all on me." Even facing death, even after multiple convictions, Gerald Gallego could not, would not, accept responsibility for what he'd done. In early 2002, Gerald's health began to deteriorate. He was diagnosed with advanced rectal cancer. Prison medical staff provided treatment, but the prognosis was terminal. On July 18, 2002, Gerald Armand Gallego died in the Nevada State Prison Medical Facility. He was 56 years old. He never showed remorse. He never apologized. He never acknowledged his victims. He died as he lived, blaming everyone else for his actions. Charlene's story is more complicated. and infinitely more controversial. She served her sentence at the Nevada Women's Correctional Center. According to prison records that I reviewed, she was considered a model prisoner. Quite compliant. No disciplinary issues. She took college courses. She stayed out of trouble. In 1997, after serving 16 years and 8 months, Charlene appeared before the Nevada Board of Parole. The hearing was contentious. Victims' families attended and spoke passionately against her release. They argued that 16 years for 10 murders was obscene. They argued that she was a manipulator who would kill again. Charlene's attorneys argued that she had been rehabilitated, that she was not a danger to society, that she had fulfilled her end of the plea bargain and deserved to have her sentence honored. The parole board deliberated for 3 hours. In July 1997, Charlene Williams Gallego was released on parole. She was 41 years old. Where is Charlene Williams now? That's deliberately kept secret. Part of her parole conditions included the right to change her name and relocate to an undisclosed state. Some reports from investigators I've spoken with suggest she married and started a new life, possibly in the Midwest. Others say she lives alone under an assumed identity, constantly looking over her shoulder, always worried that someone will recognize her. She's legally prohibited from profiting from her crimes, so no books, no interviews, no media appearances. For all intents and purposes, Charlene Williams Gallego disappeared into American society. And that raises the question that still generates fierce debate. Should she have been released at all? After actively participating in at least 10 murders, does 16 years constitute justice? I don't have an answer to that. I'm not sure anyone does. What I can tell you is this: the victims' families feel justice was not served. Many legal experts believe the plea bargain, while pragmatic, set a dangerous precedent. And the question of Charlene's true nature, victim or villain, remains unresolved. Before we move to the final analysis, I want to take a moment to remember the victims. Because ultimately, this case isn't about Gerald and Charlene. It's about the innocent lives they destroyed. Brenda Judd, 14 years old. Sandra Colley, 13 years old. Rhonda Scheffler, 17 years old. Kippy Vaught, 17 years old. Stacy Redican, 17 years old. Karen Chipman Twiggs, 17 years old. Craig Miller, 22 years old. Mary Beth Sowers, 21 years old. And at least 2 other victims whose names we may never know, whose bodies were never found, whose families never received closure or justice. These were real people. They had dreams. They had futures. They had families who loved them and still grieve for them today, more than 40 years later. They were daughters and sons. They were friends. They were students planning their futures. They were people who helped a stranger in a parking lot because they were kind and didn't suspect danger. And they were taken by 2 people who saw them as nothing more than objects for their twisted fantasies. Their names deserve to be remembered long after the killers are forgotten. I've spent months researching this case. I've reviewed thousands of pages of court documents, psychological evaluations, and investigative reports. I've consulted with forensic psychologists, criminal profilers, and legal experts. And the question everyone wants answered is this: why? Why did this happen? What creates people like Gerald and Charlene Gallego? Let me share what I've learned. Let's start with Gerald. Was he born a monster, or was he created by his circumstances? The arguments for nature, for biological predisposition, are compelling. His father was a convicted murderer. Multiple psychological evaluations diagnosed Gerald with antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic traits, and a complete lack of empathy. Brain scans done years later showed abnormalities in regions associated with impulse control and emotional regulation. Some criminologists argue that Gerald was essentially born without the capacity for empathy or moral reasoning, that no amount of intervention could have changed what he was. But the nurture argument is equally strong. Gerald's childhood was marked by severe instability and trauma. His mother was in and out of his life. He witnessed repeated domestic violence. He was shuffled between relatives and institutions. He had no consistent parenting, no positive male role models, no intervention when early warning signs appeared. Dr. Michael Stone, a forensic psychiatrist who has extensively studied serial killers and wrote about the Gallego case, explained it to me this way. Gerald Gallego represents what I call a perfect storm scenario. You have genetic predisposition toward violence and lack of empathy, combined with severe environmental trauma and complete absence of intervention. Either factor alone might not have created a serial killer, but together, with no protective factors to counterbalance them, they created someone capable of extreme violence without remorse. In other words, Gerald was both born with vulnerabilities and made worse by his environment. He's a case study in how nature and nurture can conspire to create a monster. But understanding that doesn't excuse what he did. It just helps us understand how to potentially prevent the next Gerald Gallego. But Charlene is the case that divides experts. And honestly, it's the part of this investigation that kept me up at night. On one hand, there's credible evidence that she was manipulated and coerced. Gerald was violent, controlling, and 10 years older. Some psychologists argue that Charlene was groomed and coerced, that she suffered from what's now called coercive control, a form of psychological abuse where one partner gradually isolates and controls another. There's also the possibility of what some experts call Stockholm Syndrome, or traumatic bonding, where victims of abuse paradoxically become attached to and complicit with their abusers as a survival mechanism. But on the other hand, the evidence shows clear, active participation. Multiple witnesses described Charlene as calm, even cheerful, when approaching victims. Letters she wrote showed genuine excitement about the crimes, not fear or coercion. She came from a stable, middle-class background with no history of abuse before meeting Gerald. And critically, there were multiple opportunities for her to escape or seek help. She had access to phones. She visited her family. She worked jobs. She could have told someone, anyone, what was happening. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a prominent forensic psychologist who has written extensively about female serial killers and killer couples, analyzed the Gallego case and concluded, Charlene Williams wasn't just following orders. She enabled and actively participated in these crimes. She may have been influenced by Gerald, that's true, but she made choices. She chose to approach those victims. She chose to participate in their assaults. She chose not to seek help or escape. Those were her choices, and those choices directly resulted in deaths. So which is it? Victim or villain? The honest answer is, probably both. Charlene was likely influenced and manipulated by Gerald. But she was also an active, willing participant who made choices that led to deaths. The legal system decided she deserved a chance at redemption. Whether that was justice is for you to decide. What Gerald and Charlene represent is something criminologists call compliant victim or folie à deux killers. Couples where one dominant partner and one submissive partner feed each other's worst impulses. We've seen this pattern before in criminal history. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley in the UK. Fred and Rose West. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka in Canada. In each case, you have a dominant male with violent fantasies and a female partner who becomes instrumental to the crimes, often serving as a lure because women are perceived as less threatening. But here's what's crucial to understand. These dynamics don't excuse the behavior. They explain how it happens, but they don't remove culpability. Charlene may have been influenced by Gerald, but she still made the choice to participate. 10 times. This case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches serial killer couples. It changed how prosecutors handle plea bargains with accomplices. And it raised questions about justice, culpability, and rehabilitation that we're still grappling with today. After all my research, after consulting experts and reviewing thousands of pages of documents, I still don't have all the answers. And I'm not sure anyone does. Was Charlene a victim who became a perpetrator? Or was she always capable of violence and just needed the right partner to bring it out? Should she have been released after 16 years? Did justice truly get served in this case? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're genuine dilemmas that don't have easy answers. What I do know is this: 10 innocent people died. 10 families had their lives shattered in ways they will never recover from. And 2 people, Gerald and Charlene, are responsible for that. Gerald paid with his life, eventually. Charlene paid with 16 years and then walked free. Whether that's justice is something each of us has to decide for ourselves. If there's anything to take from this case, it's this: evil rarely looks like what we expect. It doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. It doesn't wear a mask or carry a sign. Sometimes it comes in the form of a friendly woman in a mall parking lot, smiling and asking if you need help or want to make some money. So trust your instincts. If something feels off, if a situation makes you uncomfortable even slightly, listen to that feeling. Remove yourself from the situation. Your safety is more important than being polite. And if you witness something suspicious, if you see someone who looks uncomfortable or in danger, do what that witness did in November 1980. Get involved. Call police. Write down a license plate. Get a description. That one action, that one witness who wrote down a license plate number, ended a 2-year killing spree. Never underestimate the power of paying attention and taking action. If you found this investigation valuable, if you appreciated the deep dive into not just what happened but why it happened and what it means, consider hitting that like button. It genuinely helps other true crime enthusiasts find in-depth content like this. And if you want more investigations into cases that changed criminal justice, cases that raise difficult questions and force us to examine the nature of evil and justice, subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to explore. Thank you for watching this investigation into Gerald and Charlene Gallego, the so-called love slave killers. I want to end where we should always end in cases like these, by remembering the victims. The real people whose lives were stolen. The families who still grieve. Their names deserve to be remembered long after the killers are forgotten. Rest in peace.